might be interested to know that my very first cooking job was just out there at the Isles of Shoals, preparing meals for students and faculty at the Shoals Marine Laboratory. This is back in 1974 on Appledore Island. I'd been invited by a friend, a former music student of mine back in Ithaca, New York, to be his assistant chef for one season to begin with. It was kind of a working vacation. For me, it was a chance, an opportunity to get away from the routine I'd fallen into as a working musician, and for him, it was a chance to continue our lessons, probably for free. Part of our charge was to supplement the students' courses, which were introductions to the marine sciences, by giving them direct personal experience with as many species as possible as food. In those last years before the 200-mile limit was imposed, we'd get occasional visits from small eastern rig trawlers headed back to Gloucester from the fishing grounds off the Maine coast, who would stop by and give me an opportunity to go down to the boat and select fish for our kitchens from the pristine top of the catch, the very last fish to have been hauled aboard the boat before the crew secured the gear and headed back to port. This was fish in such immaculate condition when we were able to get it that it completely spoiled me for what sometimes passes for fresh in today's markets. I found out a little bit later that among some boats, after I had taken over the kitchen from my friend after his departure, that I'd gotten a bit of a reputation for being this inexperienced, totally bonkers kid cooking out at the Shoals who would buy just about any weird, slimy thing they could dredge up. The slimier, the better, ideally with head, guts, and gills completely intact. Fish with almost no market value that were unfamiliar to everybody, including me, were precisely the species that we were seeking. So the boats actively began to sort of hold out for us, stuff that in those days they would typically discard. Cunners, skates and rays, sculpins, sea ravens, wolffish, even small sharks. We'd go down to the boat, crate up a couple of 100 pounds at a time, haul it back up to the kitchen, and the students would come in and help cut and fillet. The students' intense curiosity about what lay in front of them on the prep table actually increased my curiosity about what was going on as well. I mean, these were fish that were never to be seen unless you were really close to salt water. This was an amazing opportunity for us. In the service of science and gastronomy, we'd open bellies to identify stomach contents to see what these fish were eating. In the stomach of one 40-pound cod that I recall, and by the way, there aren't that many 40-pound cods around right now, at least available to us in local markets, I was amazed to see hundreds of 1-inch baby lobsters lined up in perfectly neat rows, all facing the same direction, backwards toward the cod's mouth. This was an amazing experience. I could imagine that cod cruising along the gravelly bottom, sipping lobsters and rounding out a sagging potbelly on an amazingly rich diet. For a young, reforming musician with no training in the sciences or natural history, this was an epiphany. Two iconic Maine fisheries were manifestly interconnected. What an opportunity this was, what an amazing discovery. I began to think more about what it was that bound all these creatures together in some kind of a web, a food web. And as things went along and as we began to think more about what this actually meant and how it would affect our choices for food in the future, a number of things occurred to me. One was that we had an opportunity to utilize, like we now have in restaurants, to use every part of every fish that came into our kitchen. The students were so curious about things that we got excited about holding out, rescuing, and using various allegedly edible fish parts that normally went into the compost pile, swim bladders, tongues and cheeks, roe and milt, livers, all the nasty bits. And this was decades before the current enthusiasm for utilizing all the parts of farm animals, sometimes referred to as nose-to-tail cooking, which some of you may know is practically an article of faith in the farm-to-table culture of New England restaurants today. Maine people often say with some pride, some variation of the idea that no state looks like Maine. But I'd carry that one step further and say that, as far as I'm concerned, no state tastes like Maine. I've cooked in a number of regions in the United States, special events in different locations, and have almost always been a little bit surprised by how disappointing some of the foods grown in those locations actually can be. That many of the foods grown on beautiful farms elsewhere exhibit none of the intensity of flavor, of character, of complexity that we've come to take for granted in the produce and other foods that come from my local farms down in Maine. Let me give you this illustration. I once cooked at an event in Northern California on a beautiful organic farm where the soils, the Mediterranean climate, the state-of-the-art irrigation, and the innovative farming techniques combined to create an agricultural paradise. The plants grown on that farm had every advantage that climate and human skill could bestow. But when I went out to pick from a lush hedgerow of various colored and flavored basils, 4 feet tall and stunningly gorgeous in that environment, bringing them back to the kitchen, I had to struggle to coax flavor and aroma out of them. What was going on? I asked the farmer where he got the seeds for those particular basil varieties, and I thought they all looked really familiar. They looked familiar to anybody who gardens for herbs here in New England. And he told me, to some surprise, that they came from Johnny's Select Seeds in Albion, Maine, precisely the supplier of all the seeds that my farmers grow for my kitchen. So what accounts for the difference? Looking around, trying to figure this out in that amazing, dry, breezy climate, it occurred to me suddenly that there were no bugs. New England gardeners, let's pause and contemplate that for a moment. I've wondered since if one reason why so many New England foods exhibit such intensity and complexity is precisely because of the mortal threats they face routinely in our challenging environment. Extremes of weather, short growing season, copious blights, and insect pests. Many of the molecules that make these foods delicious and most appealing to humans actually are created in the tissues of the plants to defend against threats. Insect pests, for example. I brought along a little show and tell today. Morel mushrooms, first of the season, really sought after by mushroom lovers everywhere, and really one of the most expensive treats we can get when we can get them. They don't grow well in Maine because our soil is so acidic and there's so little calcium available. But we sometimes find them in areas that have burned over. So now that we're having fires this year, we may actually see them pop up next year. This is actually just the visible part of a fungus, an underground thread-like, incredibly fine network that extends through the forest, living in an intimate relationship with the roots of trees and other plants. Some forest fungi make their living by decomposing dead plant material, recycling it into humus, and feeding the forest with its nutrients. To taste this morel is to taste the forest itself, gathered to itself by the fungus, in all of its smoky, meaty, earthy deliciousness. This is a taste of place. This is honey from my own beehives in Bowdoinham. My hives are located near the floodplain of Merrymeeting Bay. And one of the most mesmerizing treats about owning some beehives is that early in the morning when the sun first comes up and warms the hives and the bees begin to activate for the day, I can stand behind the hives and line the bees, that is, watch the bee line and try to figure out where it is that they're going for foraging. Most often, they're headed directly to the organic farm fields that line the estuary and rivers of Merrymeeting Bay. And I know that they're heading down there to forage for pollen on some flowering plants and to collect sweet nectar from others. A spoonful of this honey nectar concentrated and thickened by evaporating water, just as a cook reduces a sauce, or a sugar house boils maple sap to syrup, is a taste of that place. Remember the monkfish I told you about earlier? Here's a beauty. I have a special affection for this fish. The great food writer Alan Davidson, bear with me for a second, the great food writer Alan Davidson included this in his book, North Atlantic Seafood, one of the most used books on my shelves, in a grab bag category of fish under the heading Diverse Uncouth Species. See why I like it? Sometimes, when I was back here in the 70s, it was called goosefish around these parts, and has sometimes been lumped in as angler because of its hunting method. It claims a piece of bottom real estate, wallows itself into a shallow foxhole, waits in ambush, and waves, can you see this? This tiny lure on a spine between the eyes. When prey come to investigate, that cavernous mouth pops open, and the inrush of water drags the prey fish with it. The interesting thing about monkfish is that they seem to take on the taste of whatever they've been eating, most conspicuously when they've been able to capture sweet crustaceans like shrimp and crab. Sometimes they taste surprisingly like lobster, and in fact, sometimes are called, popularly, poor man's lobster, although, frankly, I think that has more to do with the structure and texture of the flesh than its frequent taste. Inside the bellies of monkfish, we've seen the usual suspects, juvenile flatfish and herrings. In fact, any small fish gullible enough to take the bait. But once I even found inside a monkfish another monkfish whole that was not much smaller than the one that ate it. That was an amazing experience. The part that we eat of the monkfish typically are the fillets that come off both sides of the tail. That's the part you typically see in restaurants, but other parts are delicious. The cheeks and the liver. The liver is a bit like oceanic foie gras. It's really hauntingly wonderful. It's a delicacy in Japan and very expensive, but we also love to serve it in our restaurant in Portland. To eat a monkfish with its liver, cheeks, and tail fillets is to taste an entire community of creatures in a single package. Elsewhere along the Maine coast, marine nutrients feed the land. For 2 centuries before the widespread use of artificial fertilizers, salt marsh grasses were cut and hauled in ox carts along with some of their reeking muck to fertilize farm fields along our river valleys. A sheep farmer I've been associated with for 20 years and more keeps a free-ranging breeding flock of sheep on an offshore island. That's a practice that goes back 300 years. The sheep feed on the grasses of the meadows and enrich the island soil with their droppings. In fact, another shepherd friend of mine claims that he can tell which islands out there on the seascape contain sheep by the brilliant green of their meadows. By the way, the sheep also, at low tide, go down to the shorefront and snack on the salty, crisp seaweeds that wash up and dry in the sun. The taste of these lambs just off the island environment is like no meat available anywhere. When they come off the island, they're brought to the farmers' home pastures back on the mainland. Besides the sheep droppings, those pastures are fertilized with a big pile of compost that the farmer brews from the shells of crabs from a local picking operation that supplies crab meat to local restaurants. What I'm hoping you'll take from this is a sense of how cooking provides an outline of a way to look at the world, of connecting dots, and how the processes of growing, harvesting, and eating provide a way actively and consciously to participate in nature and to connect nature to community. Thank you.